Thank you for your leadership, and thank you for spending this time with us this morning. Mr. Secretary, good morning. Welcome back to the State and Foreign Operations Subcommittee. We appreciate you being here today to discuss the fiscal year 2025 budget request. Let me also thank you for your service, your willingness to serve our country, as well as the men and women of the department who are so often unsung heroes, but we appreciate their service as well. Now, Mr. Secretary, I was really prepared to discuss the specifics of the budget request today, but I'm so deeply concerned by, frankly, the dangerous policies being pursued by this administration. Don't take my word for it. Look around, the world is up in flames. But most notably, I want to focus towards Israel. In this critical moment in history, I'm so concerned that I frankly just scrapped all the work that we had done preparing for this hearing. Instead, I'm going to use my time during the statement to focus on this alone. This administration is playing a very dangerous game with Israel's security and, by extension, frankly, our own national security. So here's what we know. The Biden administration is withholding certain weapons to Israel in its time of greatest need, as it faces a threat to its very existence as a nation state. We also know that apparently that wasn't enough, because the president said during an interview with CNN that he will withhold all offensive weapons to Israel if they go after Hamas in Rafah, which is frankly stunning. And just that one moment, the president made it harder for our hostages, which include Americans, to be freed. He emboldened Hamas, Hezbollah, and the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism, Iran. And let's be honest, he gave a green light to the International Criminal Court. That one statement was likely viewed around the world as a defining moment, creating even greater doubt about the strength and the reliability of the United States as a security partner. Communist China and Russia must have been overjoyed by the president's pronouncements. You know, I'm sure that it will be included in their talking points. It'll be now in their talking points when they're trying to woo foreign leaders to come to their corners. Despite the administration's grand rhetoric about countering malign influence of China and other adversaries, frankly, their policies are doing the exact opposite. Of course, this is not in isolation. After the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, there is example after example of this administration, frankly, treating allies like enemies and enemies like allies. Condemn your partners, even publicly, and pressure them for any number of issues where maybe they think that it's, I don't know, keeping the high ground or maybe politically expedient, and then turn around and appease the enemies of the United States, even the most brutal dictatorships. It's hard to imagine a more damaging foreign policy to the national security interests of the United States. Mr. Secretary, I've heard you say that Hamas embeds itself with civilians within hospitals, schools, apartment buildings, and refugee camps. You have also said it is Hamas's responsibility to stop those practices in order to avoid harming civilians, and that the war could be over if Hamas would lay down its arms, surrender the leaders who are responsible for the slaughter and the torture and the murder and the rapes of October 7th. And you have, on occasion, noted the lack of other voices making those same claims among the local protesters against Israel. And Mr. Secretary, you're absolutely right. But it's truly unfortunate that every statement made by officials from this administration does not start with this very premise that I just quoted you saying. How can you ensure the protection of innocent civilians? By Hamas releasing the hostages and surrendering, period. It's just not that difficult. How do you increase pressure on Hamas? Not by publicly rebuking and shaming Israel and withholding weapons, not by letting sanctions expire on the terrorist state of Iran, which funds Hamas, not by planning to restart aid to UNRWA, which cannot be untangled from Hamas, not by sending condolences after the death of the butcher of Tehran, when thankfully he will no longer be around to torture and kill and maim innocent Iranians just because they want freedom and human rights. It's pretty simple, Mr. Secretary. We must let Israel do its job and destroy Hamas. We cannot stand between Israel and their fight against terrorism for their own survival. We must do what we say and demonstrate real ironclad commitment to Israel's security. And by doing so, we can begin to reverse this administration's damaging foreign policy disasters, which have emboldened our enemies and weakened the credibility of the United States around the world. I wish it were not the case, but the comments made by former Defense Secretary Robert Gates still hold true today, that Joe Biden has been wrong on nearly every major foreign policy issue. We need to do better, Mr. Secretary, before it's too late. I understand you have an incredibly difficult job. As I mentioned at the start, I do have great respect for your service, and by the way, for the fact that we've been able to have frank conversations. But as chairman of this subcommittee, which provides the funding for your department, we need to know how you need to know how deeply concerned I am about this administration's lack of a strong, cohesive, consistent foreign policy. With that, I now would like to yield to the distinguished ranking member of the subcommittee for her opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Blinken, appreciate you taking the time to be with us this morning. I don't believe it has ever been more urgent for the case to be made on the central role of development and diplomacy. And of course, the chairman spent his time talking about Israel, because I don't believe that the majority can defend this allocation, because the allocation is indefensible. And also, I'd like to hear in your testimony the whole issue of humanitarian assistance in Gaza, and the 35,000+ people who have been killed, and the strategies of Israel in terms of how productive these strategies have been into ensuring Israel's security also. The challenges of the 21st century, they can't be solved by one nation. Our president recognizes that these challenges require teamwork. They require alliances, and they require true partnerships. And that's why I am really just quite frankly appalled about the trends that we're seeing in the State Foreign Operations Appropriations Bill. The fiscal year 2024 House bill proposed a huge 15% cut from the prior year. We battled back to almost a 6% cut as the final level, but still face the greatest percentage cut across appropriations bill, the greatest. As of this hearing today, the House majority has told us that they plan to cut the bill a further 11% for fiscal 25. We have a problem, Mr. Secretary. The world will continue to get smaller. We have migration issues, climate, disease, even the flow of goods and crime, unfortunately, such as drugs. They're problems that are begging for a global approach. Countries overseas continue to see the United States as a beacon of hope and promise, but I don't know how long that's going to last. How long will we be able to rest on the achievements of prior generations? The Marshall Plan, the eradication of smallpox, the end of the Cold War, PEPFAR, before we realize that we are no longer offering the same leadership. My colleagues are often quick to focus on the influence of the People's Republic of China. But I will point out that China has now more embassies and more diplomats around the world than the United States does. More. Simply put, we are being outnumbered just when countries are clamoring for greater partnerships with the United States. It's not just important that the United States is showing up for partners around the world, but equally important to face the fact that America is showing. Diversity is the American and our country's superpower. However, far too often, the representation of the United States is not reflective of the full spectrum of backgrounds and experiences that America has to offer. And I know you agree with us on this. It's true for the workforce, but it's also true who the department works with. The president has set a goal to increase the share of contract dollars going to small and disadvantaged businesses to 15% across the federal government by fiscal '25. So I commend the State Department for already exceeding that goal. But Mr. Secretary, let me tell you, that obscures the fact that Black, Asian Americans, and Hispanic-owned small businesses are getting less than 2% each of State Department contracts. That's 2% each. I believe African American-owned firms is at 1.9%. AAPI firms are at 1.45%, and Hispanic firms are at 1.9%. I'm a former 8A contractor, Mr. Secretary, in the 80s and 90s, and this is less than what was taking place in terms of contracting then. And so we have to understand and look at why these numbers are shockingly low. We've got to do a better job making sure that historically disadvantaged entrepreneurs get a larger share of the State Department contract. Members, Mr. Secretary, they're outraged, and so I intend to follow up, and I just wanted to let you know with a letter to the department asking you to outline the strategy to increase the share of contract dollars that go to all historically disadvantaged groups, and why Black and Asian American and Hispanic firms are being denied access to these contracts. Now, 20 years ago, after we first started talking about this three-legged stool of national security, diplomacy, development, and defense, we are no closer to bringing balance to that stool. In fact, we have never been so lopsided. The resources that we spend on defense dwarf the resources that we spend on our overseas presence, the pursuit of American interests, and our most basic partnerships to build a safer world. I'm sure that you see this every day. We over-rely on our military tools because that's what's available, meanwhile starving our civilian diplomatic tools. Our military understands this and is often the first to advocate for development and diplomatic tools that they see as necessary. However, successive Congresses have refused to make the investments needed to take the pressure off of military action. And now, once again, our diplomatic and development activities are facing the biggest cuts of any part of the United States government. We can't keep going on like this. If we're serious about confronting these challenges, then it must be reflected in our budget. Without sufficient development funding, we face a future struck by cycles of crises that require more and more humanitarian interventions and even military interventions and result in a less stable world. Secretary Blinken, you're currently crisscrossing the globe. You're listening to partners. You're hunting for joint solutions. And I'm sure getting an earful about United States policy. I'm eager to hear from you today what tools that you need, that the State Department needs to advance the mission of the United States and provide the leadership and partnerships of the world that the world, quite frankly, expects of us. What do you see as the cost of us stepping back and letting others fill the void? I see that everywhere in the world. What investments are we leaving on the table? The opportunities left untaken. What do you hear from our brave diplomats around the world and what they need to do their job? And I want to thank them for their service and their sacrifices, which they're making. And I want them to know that we do value their work in spite of these huge, horrific, terrible, deep cuts that are being proposed. So I look forward to our work together, Mr. Secretary, also with you, Chairman Diaz-Balart, and with all the members of this subcommittee to make the case for why this bill needs to invest more this year and in future years to serve America, to serve the American people, and yes, quite frankly, our entire planet. So thank you, Mr. Secretary, and I yield back.
Thank you. Now it's a privilege and an honor to yield to the chairman of the Full Appropriations Committee, Mr. Tom Cole, for his opening statement. Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Chairman Diaz-Balart, Ranking Member Lee, Ranking Member Delauro, and my fellow appropriators. I'm so pleased to be back with the State and Foreign Operations Committee. I previously served on this subcommittee, both with our distinguished Chairwoman Emeritus Kay Granger, Chairwoman Emeritus Nita Lowy, and the legendary Hal Rogers, Chairman Emeritus. So I know this committee is well stocked with talented people. And experience tells us that the work done before this committee is of critical importance to America's national security. Secretary Blinken, we appreciate your appearance before us today and your service to our country. There's no denying we're facing a time of increasing global disorder and rising threats to the security of the United States. We all know that historical analogies can be misleading, yet it is hard not to see haunting parallels between the conflicts raging across Europe and in the Middle East and another dark time in world history, the 1930s. The disturbing echoes of that dangerous decade are certainly before us. In Europe, Vladimir Putin's warped dream of a new Russian empire has led to the unjust and brutal invasion of his democratic neighbor, Ukraine. In the Indo-Pacific, the Chinese Communist Party continues its efforts to undermine the rules-based order, threaten Taiwan, and seek Chinese strategic domination in Asia and beyond. And in the Middle East, Israel faces threats on multiple fronts, beginning with the horrific attack launched by Hamas on October 7th. Even now, the terrorist regime in Iran is using missiles and proxies to threaten Israel and the United States' interests across the region. As you know, many of us on this panel were deeply disappointed at the administration's decision to pause very vital weapon transfers to our friend Israel. In my judgment, utilizing these weapons transfers as leverage over Israel's military decisions during this critical time is both dangerous and self-defeating. Moreover, withholding arms to Israel has our adversaries celebrating. It weakens Israel's deterrence against Iran as well as Hamas and Hezbollah. I'm deeply concerned over the signal it sends to these terrorists and enemies of both our nation and of Israel. Meanwhile, in what some have called an axis of upheaval, our sworn adversaries in Beijing, Moscow, and Tehran are increasingly joining hands to challenge us and to challenge Western institutions, democratic values, and the cause of freedom. The prospect of greater military, economic, and technological cooperation between these hostile authoritarian powers can only be deeply disturbing to the United States, our allies, and our partners. Here at home, the unprecedented flow of illegal immigrants across the southern border and the uptick in dangerous and deadly drugs such as fentanyl into our country have brought America to an important crossroads that demands clear leadership. Mr. Secretary, your budget request for the coming year aims to address some of these challenges, but I am concerned that in some respects it's missed the mark. I am pleased at the request to fully fund security assistance for Israel and Egypt, a proposed increase for the Indo-Pacific region, as well as for international narcotics and law enforcement funding, which is critical to countering the transnational criminal network trafficking in fentanyl and other deadly narcotics. I am, however, concerned that the budget proposes billions in additional mandatory funding and other budgetary gimmicks. These incentives appear to ignore our deteriorating fiscal outlook, and frankly, Congress is unlikely to adopt them. When your department or any executive branch agency resorts to budgetary gamesmanship rather than making the hard strategic choices necessitated by limited resources, it does a disservice to your cause. Mr. Secretary, again, I want to thank you and the men and women who serve in the Department of State for your service, and I look forward to your testimony and the dialogue to follow. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's always a pleasure to also yield to the ranking member of the full committees, Ms. Delauro, for her opening statements.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Lee, and pleasure to have the chair at the meeting as well. Thank you, Secretary Blinken, for being here today and for what you and the devoted public servants of the Department of State do to protect Americans' security and interests, to project America's strength, share our values, celebrate our common cause with those who support freedom and democracy around the world. Unfortunately, the majority has recently revealed that they are prepared to cut the state and foreign operations funding bill by more than 11%. That would decimate your department's ability to conduct diplomacy around the world at a time when America's diplomatic might is as critical to our national security as our defense capabilities. Later in this hearing, I plan to ask you about the damage to our diplomatic capabilities that a $7 billion cut to the State Department's funding bill would bring, and the losses it would entail for State Department personnel, from Foreign Service officers to aid workers. We are at a critical juncture in our history. Wars in Europe and the Middle East have tested our nation's resolve. I was greatly disturbed and still am by the majority's lack of resolve to pass security and humanitarian aid for months while our allies waited. Our adversaries took advantage and humanitarian disasters unfolded. But thankfully, despite the majority's unnecessary delays, we did pass the supplemental security funding. We showed our trusted allies that we have their back and that our word can be counted on. I believe it is our duty to support Ukraine's victory over Russia. We cannot let Vladimir Putin be successful in his ambition to expand Russia's territory by force. Of course, arms and munitions are not all we are providing Ukraine. The State Department is administering $9.5 billion in forgivable loans to support Ukraine's government, its energy sector, and other infrastructure, and its first responders, healthcare workers, and teachers. And I look forward to learning more about how you are working to ensure Ukraine's economic stability. And in the Middle East, while we must support Israel's defense against aggression from Iran and its proxies like Hamas and Hezbollah, the situation in Gaza is increasingly dire. 1.1 million Gazans, half its population, are on the brink of famine due to this conflict. We have a moral obligation to ensure that humanitarian aid appropriated and obligated by this Congress can reach Gazans, and we must ensure that this conflict does not spread. These are not just feel-good activities. They are central to the security of Israel, the United States, and the region for generations into the future. While the situation on the ground in Israel and Gaza is urgent, commands our attention, the State Department is also leading negotiations to secure the release of the hostages and must prepare for the future of this region. And I know you agree that planning with regional partners must happen now, and how we bring about a ceasefire and a peaceful end to this conflict. All of this takes resources. And even as these conflicts continue, the State Department is also focused on the growing influence of China throughout the world, as the State Department works to preserve the rules-based international order through diplomacy. Moreover, China is rapidly expanding its military and technological capabilities. The State Department's work is crucial to maintaining the United States' competitive advantage, and that work, again, requires sufficient resources. There is a small faction in this Congress that believes that we should put America first by building walls between us and the rest of the world. I strongly believe that we put America first by demonstrating the power of American leadership, that we have the strength and the determination and the heart to fight for the most vulnerable people, protect the freedom of our allies, and share American values around the world. I thank you for appearing before this subcommittee, and I thank you for your public service to our country. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Secretary Blinken, as you know, your full written statement will be placed in the record. Obviously, feel free to summarize your testimony, as we said before. Thank you for being here, and now you are recognized, sir.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Always good to be with you. Chairman Cole, thank you for being here this morning. Ranking Member Lee, Ranking Member Delauro, all of the distinguished members of the subcommittee, thanks for the opportunity this morning to testify before you. And thank you for the partnership that we have had to work to advance American leadership in a world at a time when it is so essential having that leadership in order to deliver on the priorities that actually matter to our people here at home. I think the need for U.S. global leadership and cooperation with allies and partners has never been greater. If we're not engaged, if we're not leading, then we know someone else will, and likely not in a way that advances our interests and values. Or maybe even worse, no one does, and then you're going to have a vacuum that's filled by bad things before it's filled by good things. At the same time, we know that the very nature of the problems that we face, the greater multiplicity and a greater complexity, requires cooperation, coordination, work with allies and partners. That's more imperative than it's been in my time here as well. People's Republic of China has pursuing military, economic, geopolitical preeminence, challenging our vision for a free, open, secure, and prosperous international order. Russia's committing aggression not only against Ukraine, but against the principles at the heart of the United Nations Charter: sovereignty, territorial independence and integrity, independence, which are the very building blocks of global peace and security. In the Middle East, we've been standing with Israel in its efforts to ensure that what happened on October 7th never happens again, as we do everything we can to bring about an end to the terrible human suffering of Palestinians in Gaza and to prevent the conflict from spreading to other fronts. U.S. leadership is needed to address humanitarian crises elsewhere around the world, including in Sudan, Haiti. We've seen millions of people in many other places displaced and killed. We have to focus, and we are, on them. And also, many of you said, the global issues that no one country can solve alone, whether that's food security, changing climate, transnational corruption, the fentanyl crisis.
Greed and hypocrisy of our democracy have been exposed. Free Palestine to free us all.
Mr. Secretary.
All liberation struggles are connected. You should be arresting Blinken, not me. You should be arresting Blinken, not me.
We will not have disturbances in this committee. Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. But with the support of Congress, we can and we are approaching these challenges from a position of strength. Because of the actions we've taken, the United States is stronger economically, militarily, diplomatically than we were a few years ago. We've made historic investments here at home in our competitiveness, in our innovation, in our infrastructure. We've renewed our alliances. We built new ones and secured unprecedented alignment with key partners in Europe and Asia and beyond. We've delivered essential American aid to Ukraine, and we've called the international community to share the burden. For every dollar that we've spent in Ukraine, economic or development assistance, others have collectively invested 3 more. Now, I know there was doubt about whether bipartisan support for Ukraine and other urgent national security priorities could endure, but last month, Congress demonstrated to the world that we will not pull back when you passed President Biden's supplemental funding bill by an overwhelming margin. Law does not come at the expense of our strength at home. Far from it. Most of the supplemental is being spent here in the United States, building up our own defense industrial base, supporting thousands of good American jobs. But we need to keep up this momentum. That requires a State Department budget that we fully resource so that we can actually meet the challenges of this moment. The FY25 budget the President's put forward, requesting $58.8 billion for the State Department and USAID, does that in 2 key ways. First, it funds the essential missions of our department and USAID. The budget will ensure that the United States continues to be the partner of choice for countries around the world when they turn to us and look to us to help them solve problems that they're trying to solve, but that are also profoundly in our interest to help solve. In an era of renewed great power competition, we have to present the strongest possible offer, one that is relevant and responsive to countries' needs, and one that advances our security and economic interests. That's why we're requesting, among other things, $2 billion for a new fund to build high-quality, sustainable infrastructure around the world. Crucially, investments like these create jobs for Americans and expand markets for our businesses overseas. We're requesting resources for the World Bank. With $1 billion in U.S. funding, we can unlock another $36 billion in development fund capacity to direct to the top priorities of emerging economies. That's an enormous return on our investment and essential for competing with China around the world. The budget also includes $1.7 billion for international organizations, including the UN, APEC, the Inter-American Development Bank, to help shape them in ways that reflect our interests and our values. We're asking for $500 million to give more people around the world access to secure internet and digital technologies. Doing that will support the U.S. economy through the export of our technology products. It will also help ensure that we and our fellow democracies remain the leaders and standard bearers in key technologies, including artificial intelligence. Our budget includes funding to address global issues that affect the lives and the livelihoods of the American people, as well as people around the world, especially the synthetic drug crisis. It also funds our response to irregular migration, global food insecurity, public health, climate, and energy security. We're also asking Congress to fully fund the State Department's educational and cultural exchange programs. They're one of the best, most cost-effective tools that I've seen for advancing our values and interests around the world. They support the students, the researchers, the young professionals from our communities who study and work abroad. They connect us in the world with the world in powerful human ways. To outcompete our strategic rivals, we need to invest in the foundation of our strength abroad, and that is our diplomatic corps, and that's the second pillar of the budget. Our budget makes a strong investment in expanding our overseas presence, opening posts in the Pacific Islands and the Eastern Caribbean. As was noted, we want to make sure that we are represented at the ambassadorial level and that we have posts everywhere so that we can effectively represent our interests everywhere. We'll also continue our modernization of our diplomacy. We have reorganized the department in ways to make it better fit to address the challenges that we face in this moment. We're working to attract and retain the best talent, again, needed to take on these challenges. We're investing in our people in Washington and overseas with training, with technology, with support. We're promoting greater agility, greater innovation, greater efficiency in our processes. Last year's enacted budget represented a 5% cut from the year before. That challenges our efforts to deliver results that Congress expects and the American people deserve. So I urge you to support this budget, which helps us address the most pressing foreign policy priorities for the coming year and lays the foundation for continued strong American leadership in the years ahead. With that, I'm happy to address any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Members, as usual, I'll call members based on seniority of those present when the hearing was called to order, and alternating between each side. Each member will have 5 minutes for questions and responses, and I anticipate that we should have enough time for 2 rounds of questions. Mr. Secretary, I will start in the Western Hemisphere. Just ask you, you're aware, right, that in Cuba, the FBI's top 10 most wanted terrorist, Joan Chesimard, is harbored, right, by the regime. You're aware of that?
Yes.
You're aware that bombmaker William Morales of the FALN, responsible for the murder of 4 Americans, injuring 50 in New York, is also harbored by the regime in Cuba. You're aware as well that the ELN and FARC terrorists are harbored there?
Yes.
You're aware that the regime did not cooperate in the investigation regarding the so-called anomalous health incidents, the sonic health attacks against U.S. personnel. You're aware of that, right? You're aware that the Cuban dictatorship has a very extensive espionage network. The most recent case that was very public was the State Department's Victor Manuel Rocha, who pled guilty of spying for decades on Cuba's behalf. And you're aware of that, I'm assuming, as well, Mr. Secretary. You're aware that the Cuban regime recently signed a military agreement with Belarus to train Cuban nationals, and then Cuban nationals are traveling to Russia to fight, for Russia against Ukraine, correct, sir? Okay, well then, this is what caught me not by surprise, but as you know, the State Department failed to designate Cuba as a not fully cooperating country when it comes to terrorism. The rationale was that Colombia's, frankly, how do I describe him, pro-Hamas, pro-communist, former M19 guerrilla president decided to no longer wants to extradite Marxist terrorists from Cuba. And then the Biden administration decided to resume law enforcement cooperation with the regime. Again, not to mention the fact that Cuba has thousands of intelligence agents in Venezuela, keeping Maduro in power. It is a terrorist regime. And so how does this coddling to a dangerous anti-American dictatorship with all of those issues that I just mentioned that I know you're aware of, and so many others, how does that protect U.S. national security interests?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you know, the not fully cooperating statute requires an annual review, and the basis for the designation by the previous administration was the presence of these National Liberation Army members from Colombia in Cuba. The demand at the time by the Colombian government that they be returned to Colombia, the refusal of the Cuban government to do so, hence harboring terrorists. The change this year has been that the Colombian government no longer seeks their extradition, and as you noted, we've resumed law enforcement cooperation with Cuba in the national interest, and thus the basis for the designation was no longer there. There are other designations, as you well know, for Cuba that remain on the books, and of course, all of the acts that you rightly cited, we continue to push back against, take steps against, wherever and whenever we can. But in this particular case, given the annual requirement, given the basis for the designation, given the changing facts, that's the determination we made.
And Mr. Secretary, but again, as we mentioned in the beginning of this, my question, those are not the only terrorists that are harbored there, including folks who have murdered Americans.
And in many cases, we have fugitives for justice who are being accused, indicted, convicted of crimes different from terrorism.
Absolutely, absolutely. So again, I just found it hard to understand that the fact that a country decided to not ask for a group of terrorists to be sent back doesn't change the fact that there are other terrorists that are there, including ones who have killed Americans, who, by the way, the regime has refused to send back to the United States, for God's sake. But anyways, again, we'll continue that the conversation, because I'm frankly taken back by that aspect. I am going to keep to the clock. I'm going to ask the rest of you to do the same. So with that, let me recognize the distinguished ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Of course, you know, when we're friends and colleagues, we disagree on Cuba, and we will continue this conversation because this 50-plus year policy of the United States toward Cuba with the embargo has not changed any dynamic that the chairman just mentioned, and we have to move toward having full normal relations with Cuba. Mr. Secretary, I know that you said this in your statement, believe in diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility. And I also know you're still struggling with a workforce that is still less diverse than the labor force, and it gets whiter and more male at each rank of seniority. Culture change is hard. It takes time, but we also need urgently to see progress because the world won't wait for us to catch up. So how and what role does DEIA play in achieving this strategy? What metrics, quantifiable metrics, will you cite for your leadership tenure as evidence of success? And what do you think are the obstacles to the success, and how can we help you and your team overcome them? Because as I travel the continent of Africa, for example, and in the Caribbean, I still don't see the diversity that this country should be presenting in our foreign service.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for your leadership on this issue. And let me just be clear at the outset why I think this is so important, to have a department that better reflects the people we represent. It's important because it's the right thing to do, but it's also important because it's the smart and necessary thing to do for our foreign policy and for our interests. We are operating in an extraordinarily diverse world. The greatest strength we bring to our ability to operate in that world and advance our interests is our own diversity. And if we are holding back, denying ourselves the talents of people from different backgrounds, different perspectives, different experiences, who have ways of engaging with the world that can make a real difference and help us solve problems by bringing these different perspectives to bear in our own policymaking, we're simply shortchanging ourselves. So it's imperative, in my judgment, that we continue to build a department that fully reflects our diversity. It is our strength around the world, and we've been working to do that. As you know, very early in my tenure, I appointed the first Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer for the department. We now have the second one who's taken over, Zakiya Carr-Johnson, who's hit the ground running. Our first Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer and that office produced the DEAI strategic plan very early on with input from employees all over the world. We finalized that plan. We set out 215 objectives in it, and I can tell you that as of this moment, about 58% or 125 of those objectives have actually been met, and we're working to complete the others. I believe we've shared that plan with you, but we can go over exactly where we are. We have DEIA as a function now of performance evaluations to make sure that people are focused on that as part of their responsibilities as they seek to advance in the department. I'd note, and I thank Congress for this, for the first time, we were able to get paid internships at the department. And that is a wonderful tool for opening the socioeconomic aperture to make sure, again, that we have a department that's better reflective of the country. And that includes making sure that we have people from communities all over the country, rural as well as urban, who are able to try out the department through an internship and then decide whether they want to pursue a career there. We have a quantitative baseline for the first time. In January of '24, we published the third year of demographic data in a public dashboard that's available to everyone. And the dashboard provides a detailed snapshot of every bureau broken out by race, by ethnicity, by gender, by disability status, by grade, by rank, by a place of origin in our country. That will allow us, I think, to see clear trend lines over the next decade. And in terms of senior leadership selection, we have at the Deputy Assistant Secretary level and above, we've added new transparency to the process with clear criteria so that people can be clearly evaluated on the merits. Now, to your point, all of this takes time, and it's not
Yeah,
flipping
but
a light
Mr.
switch.
Secretary, just very quickly, it takes time, but not 5 years, 10 years. We need to look, and you all need to look at new ways of breaking down these systemic barriers, because from what I've seen, first of all, retention is a problem.
Yep.
The cultural issues.
That's an important point. Can I just say on that? You're exactly right, because it's one thing to recruit people and bring them in, it's another thing to retain them. One of the things we've done is we've established a retention unit to try to understand why it is that people across the department may be leaving well before their time, and why, in particular, underrepresented groups may be leaving at a higher level. And that work is ongoing. We're learning a lot from that retention unit.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now we will recognize the full committee chairman, Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, as you know, the People's Republic of China has repeatedly used economic coercion against the United States, our allies, and frankly, non-aligned countries as well. Quite often trying to extract a political advantage or trap a country in a debt trap, literally, in order to have influence over its behavior. That runs very much counter, obviously, to a rules-based international order. So I'm wondering what you and the department are doing to counter those kinds of activities, and frankly, do you have the tools that you need? I know my colleague, Mr. Meeks, and I, along with Young Kim and Amy Barrow of the Foreign Relations Committee, actually have legislation to try and give you more tools to deal with that. So could you tell us how serious you view the problem and what weapons you have and are using and what weapons you might need?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think it's an important question and one we're very focused on. I'd say two things quickly about that. One is we want to make sure that wherever we can, we can create a better alternative for countries as they're looking at investment, because the main way that China exercises this coercion is, of course, by getting the leverage that comes through investments, including through Belt and Road. So we have done a tremendous amount of work putting together all of the resources and tools in our government, working with allies and partners through the PGI that the President established at the G7, Mineral Securities Partnership, and other things, to be able to effectively channel investment in places where it matters so that we can effectively compete. For us, of course, the secret sauce is the private sector. We're never going to match, and we shouldn't match China dollar for dollar when it comes to state investment. Our job is to be a catalyst of supporter for private sector investment. And as we do that, I think there's no question that most countries would prefer to work with us. However, the other side of this is when you see, exactly as you've said, examples of coercion being exercised, using economic leverage that China has to get countries to do things that it wants geopolitically. A good example of that was Lithuania a few years ago. When Lithuania took steps in terms of its relationship with Taiwan that China didn't like, China tried to squeeze Lithuania. We came in, we worked with EXIM to generate about $600 million in financing as an alternative to the money that Beijing was pulling out or threatening to pull out. We had a defense procurement agreement that DOD put forward that was very helpful as well in going to the Lithuanians. Commerce helped to support and move supply chains away from the PRC, and we mobilized posts around the Lithuania, find new markets for the markets that were being taken away when China was trying to exercise this leverage. So I think there's actually a pretty good model there, a good model actually in the way Australia responded to economic coercion some years ago from China that we can build on. And we really welcome working with you to make sure that not only do we have the tools, but the tools are adequately financed so that we can come in and create the kind of resiliency. Last thing I'd mention is the European Union's also gotten into the game on this in a big way. They have important legislation so that if states are on the receiving end of economic coercion, the EU can come in and support them.
Well, again, we'd like to work with you on that. So if there are specific things that you would need that we could be helpful with, I'd like to know. One quick question, it's probably not enough time, but Obviously, we've all been intrigued by some of the things I've read, at least, about a potential agreement with Saudi Arabia. Could you give us some sort of overview of where you are in those negotiations and where you hope to be?
So we've been working, this goes back well before October 7th, working with Saudi Arabia and with Israel to pursue normalization between the two countries. This would be a game changer. It would be the first time that Israel has normalized relations with the largest Arab and Muslim country in the world in terms of its significance, and it would reshape the region and well beyond. We have pursued the work to try to get that agreement. It requires two things. It requires first some understandings and agreements between the United States and Saudi Arabia on security, on nuclear energy, and on defense cooperation. Those agreements, in principle, are very close to being able to be concluded. Now, of course, we will come to Congress with them when they're ready to be reviewed, but we could be really weeks away from being able to conclude them. However, in order for normalization to proceed, Saudi Arabia has made very clear that even with the agreements between us completed, they have to have two things. They have to have calm in Gaza, and they have to have a credible pathway to a Palestinian state. So we, of course, are working on both. We want to see both. Whether a government in Israel in this moment is able to engage on that basis, I don't know. What I do know is, until now, this has been a hypothetical or theoretical question for Israel. Assuming we complete the agreements between the United States and Saudi Arabia, that hypothetical or theoretical question becomes a real question that they will have to answer one way or another.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Delauro, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, as I previewed in my opening remarks, I first wanted to ask you about the House, what I view as a misguided allocation for fiscal year 2025 and the impact on the State Department's critical diplomacy and development work. I was interested in the line of questioning with all the initiatives that we are talking about with regard to the State Department that need to be discussed and need to be worked on. I think at the foundation of that is what kind of resources does the department have to move forward. At the recently announced top-line funding level for state and foreign ops for the appropriation bill proposes a nearly 12% cut. That's compared to the 2024 enacted level. It's on top of an almost 6% cut from fiscal years 2023 to 2024. Let me be extremely clear. Nearly 12% cut to the SFOP's budget is a staggering $7 billion. Billion with a B. So I have three questions in this regard, Mr. Secretary. You're deeply involved in conflicts in Ukraine, Middle East, maintaining a competitive advantage against China, trying to deal with other food assistance efforts around the globe. You have to conduct its day-to-day business from D.C. You're in almost every country in the world. How would losing $7 billion from the budget affect your department's diplomatic capabilities and the implementation of U.S. foreign policy?
Thank you. It would severely undermine our efforts across the board. As you said, this would take us back to FY 2014 funding levels. In other words,
2014.
almost a decade ago. And in terms of our hiring, in terms of our support for our diplomats, for our locally engaged staff, which is 2/3 of our employee base, in terms of our operations, in terms of our programs, this would have I don't want to exaggerate by saying devastating, but close to that impact on what we're able to do to actually advance the interests of the American people. If you look at the big things that we're trying to do to effectively engage the strategic competition with China, including by creating better alternatives for countries that are looking to choose between our path and theirs, it would severely penalize those efforts. Our ability to continue to sustain support with our allies and partners for Ukraine and pushing back against Russian aggression, that would be severely undermined. Our ability to address a wide variety of global challenges that have impacts here in the United States, including things like the fentanyl crisis, as well as irregular migration, as well as dealing with climate and food security. Would each and every one of those be affected? No, because we'd have to make incredibly hard decisions, but some of them inevitably would be severely penalized. But let me be even more parochial about it, just to cite a few examples. Embassy security. We're trying to have more embassies in more places to make sure that we're fully represented. We want to open new embassies in the Pacific Islands, in the Caribbean. We need to secure those embassies. We would have trouble sustaining the current security levels for our existing embassies if we had these cuts. And then if you insulated those security programs, well, then of course the cuts would have to be felt elsewhere. Our ability to expand our diplomatic presence would probably be cut. The exchange programs that so many in Congress I know support and appreciate would face significant cuts. We probably have something like 600 or 700 fewer IVLP participants, curtailing one of our most valuable tools to connect with people around the world.
IDLP.
This is the International Visitors Leadership Program. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
We would have, I think, we want to open new passport offices in this country, in different places, to respond to what has been historic demand. We would not be able to do that. I can go down the list, and we'll obviously provide this list to Congress in the interest of time. I won't do it now, but both in terms of the big muscle movements that we need to make and very specific things that we want to sustain or grow for the American people, we would be severely penalized.
So we're looking at a loss of personnel, of frontline critical personnel, and thereby, just hurting our ability to pursue our own
That's correct.
interests. And the number of priorities that would have to be put on a back burner. And if you can, Mr. Secretary, I know how busy you are, and thereby your staff is busy, but I think it would be very, very helpful if this committee could understand what this $7 billion cut, what is the consequences? I'm not looking for percentages, I'm not looking for numbers, but the actual consequences on American foreign policy, our diplomacy, our stature in world leadership.
Be happy to provide that to you.
Thank you. I yield back.
And thank the ranking member. This subcommittee has amazing members, but I'll tell you what, for me, it's always a special honor to be able to recognize not only the Chairman Emeritus, the former Chairman of the subcommittee, but the Dean of the House, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for arranging this hearing with the Secretary and running it. And Ms. Secretary, we're delighted to see you. We thank you for your service. We pray for your safety. Fentanyl overdose is now the #1 killer of adults ages 18 to 45, destroying families, ruining lives. We've got to find a way to stop it. We know China and the Mexican cartels are the primary drivers of the problem. The Chinese ship the precursor chemicals to the Mexican cartels, who are then producing the pills and trafficking them through our borders. It seems that despite Beijing enacting new laws in 2019 to outlaw the export of fentanyl and its precursors, these efforts have not actually been enforced. Has China taken any sort of meaningful action to try to stop the export of these deadly drugs?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's very good to see you here as well. Two things. First, I wholeheartedly agree with you on the urgency, the priority that we have to place and we are placing on synthetic opioids and fentanyl. We see it devastating community after community in this country. 40% of Americans know someone who died of an opioid overdose. And as you point out, it's the #1 killer of Americans age 18 to 49. It has a domestic component, and the President has put more money into dealing with the domestic side of this in terms of prevention, in terms of treatment, in terms of recovery, in terms of public awareness than ever, and that money is getting to the communities that need it. I've seen it firsthand in Denver and Tucson and other places I visited. But for us at the State Department, we're working hard on the international side. And with regard to China, In December of last year, late November of last year, the president met with President Xi Jinping in San Francisco at the APEC summit. And a big part of that meeting and a big part of the work that we had done in the lead up to that meeting was to get an agreement from China to take more effective action against fentanyl, and particularly against the chemical precursors that are made in many cases in China, then, as you said, get shipped over to Mexico, synthesized into fentanyl, and then into our country, where Americans are killed. China has taken important but not yet sufficient steps to make a real difference in curbing the flows. It promulgated new regulations. It took down some companies that were engaged in this practice. It established a regular working group with us so that we can track progress. I was just in China a few weeks ago, and among others, I met with the Minister of Public Security on this question. And there are steps that we believe China can and should take now to really make a dent in the flow of these chemical precursors. Very public law enforcement actions, particularly to arrest, prosecute, and convict those who are engaged in this illegal transfer of the precursors. That would, I think, send a very strong deterrent message. Actually scheduling certain precursors that they've agreed to schedule and thus restrict, but have not yet done. And then there's a nexus that we've seen between some enterprises in China, a financial nexus between them and the criminal enterprises in, for example, Mexico, that needs to be cut. And there, we believe that China needs to take action to do exactly that. So we are tracking this very closely, very carefully. I think we've seen progress, real progress, but it is not yet sufficient. And we want to see that the flow of the precursors continues to come down.
Well, we're all keeping an eye on China and what they're doing, or more importantly, what they're not doing to keep the fentanyl from reaching our kids and our adults in the U.S. I'm not sure that they're doing all that they can. In fact, I know that's the case. Your budget proposal, you're asking $1.56 billion for international narcotics control and law enforcement. That's a $166 million increase over the fiscal 24 enacted level. How do you plan to use those funds to help end this ongoing tragedy?
One of the most critical things is continuing to build the capacity of partner countries, as well as to strengthen our cooperation with them. I think Mexico is a good example of that. We've significantly increased our collaborative efforts over the last few years with Mexico to try to disrupt, dismantle, take down these transnational criminal organizations that are engaged in trafficking, as well as to deal with the financial networks. We have worked with them, for example, with information and support that's produced dozens of arrests of first and second tier operatives in these criminal enterprises. They've seized a record amount of fentanyl. They've disrupted production facilities, but all of that comes with our assistance, our support. So this is just one example of where the additional funds would allow us to further strengthen their own capacity to deal there. Second, the border itself. Very important that we deploy the most modern and effective technology in detecting efforts to smuggle fentanyl or other synthetic opioids into the United States. We have the technology. It's both the old kind, things like canines can be very effective, but also actual technology, screening technology. And we've seen that based on our best assessments, the overwhelming majority of the fentanyl that's coming into this country is coming through our ports of entry. And so deploying that technology on both sides, the Mexican side and our side, that can make a big difference.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. We're gonna. I hate cutting off the dean, but I apologize, but I feel obligated to do so, Mr. Chairman.
If you insist.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Ms. Ming, who I know is not upset that the dean went a little bit long, correct? You're recognized.
Problem. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Blinken, before I ask my question, I wanted to thank you and your team for listening to the concerns about extended passport processing times that I raised last year in this hearing. Since then, standard processing times have been reduced to 6 to 8 weeks, and expediting processing is down to just 2 to 3 weeks. My constituents and Americans all over the country have directly benefited from these improvements, and I urge you to continue to build on them heading into fiscal year 25 to continue to reduce passport and visa wait times for all of our constituents. My first question is, the fiscal year 25 budget request focuses on advancing peace and security in the Middle East. As we sit here, 124 hostages are being held by Hamas in Gaza, including American citizens. Today marks 228 days that they've been in captivity. As we know from those released, Hamas has inflicted deep psychological trauma and physical and sexual violence on the hostages, including women and children. Many require immediate medical attention, but Hamas still has not allowed the Red Cross to conduct a medical visit and instead releases sign-of-life videos as propaganda. Many of us here have met with the families of the hostages, and I believe we can all agree that we need to bring them home now. How does the budget help the department increase pressure on Hamas and its allies to release the hostages and bring them home?
We share your conviction and commitment that bringing hostages home is our top priority. And like you, I've met with the families of these hostages many, many times. And it's important that you point out that among the hostages are American citizens, and my first obligation is to our fellow Americans. And so we've been determined to try to bring them home, and we've been working on this every single day since they were taken. You're right as well that the International Committee of the Red Cross has not been able to get in to see them. This is something we've also worked on in the Gaza environment. That's a challenge, but we would like to see that in the interim happen. But the most important thing would be to get their release immediately. I think we've been very close to being able to get a ceasefire and hostage release on a couple of occasions. We continue to work on that. I think it is the fastest way to get the hostages home, get conditions changed in Gaza so that much more humanitarian assistance can get into the people who so desperately need it, and also create the foundation upon which to build, hopefully, a more durable, lasting, peaceful, and secure solution. So we continue to drive at that every single day, but to date, at the end of the day, when it's come down to making a decision, Hamas has not agreed to do what's necessary to get an agreement. But we continue at that, including with Egypt, Qatar, and other parties that have been helpful. The budget in supporting our diplomacy writ large, our ability to sustain that diplomacy, I think is critical. But of course, there are many other ways that I think the budget demonstrates our commitment to resolving these deep-rooted challenges, demonstrating that we have a better path forward than the path that's offered by Hamas of nihilism, of destruction, of terrorism, death, and all of our diplomatic efforts seek to move in that direction.
Thank you very much. And I wanted to quickly mention yesterday's CNN report that Egyptian mediators changed the text of the latest hostage deal at the last minute. Egypt is also refusing to allow more humanitarian aid into Gaza by opening the Rafah crossing, despite Israel's request to do so. Wanted to hear your thoughts about the accuracy of your assessment of Egypt's motivation for derailing the hostage negotiations, and what can the State Department do?
Well, two things. First, Egypt's been a critical partner in this effort in two ways. Critical partner in the effort to find an agreement on a ceasefire and hostages. A critical partner as well in trying to get humanitarian assistance into people in Gaza who need it. I can't comment on the details of the negotiations. The bottom line, though, is that Hamas has not said yes to what I think was a good proposal that was put on the table. And then with regard to humanitarian assistance, there is we have a deep concern about the Rafah gate, which I endeavored and President Biden endeavored to get open in October so that assistance could begin to flow into people who need it. That gate is closed. I think there are two things that are going on. One is, yes, it's important, I think, politically for the Egyptians to show that they are a critical actor in providing assistance. At the same time, because of combat activities near and around the gate, the environment for bringing the assistance in is really challenged. And so we need to find a way to make sure that the assistance that would go through Rafah can get through safely. But we do strongly urge our Egyptian partners to do everything that they can on their end of things to make sure that that assistance is flowing. What we don't want to see, and it's part of what we're seeing, is a reversal of the situation that we had where aid was not getting to the north where it was so desperately needed. We've got new gates and new access points open in the north, Erez, Zakim, others, things flowing in from Ashdod, only to have the south, which has been the critical hub for humanitarian assistance, be shut down, in part because of the ongoing operations in and around the gate. So
Thank
we're
you,
working
Mr.
on that every
Secretary.
single day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Carl, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you again, Mr. Secretary, for joining us today. I always find conversations with you to be quite interesting. Last time, when you appeared before us, this committee, which was last year, obviously, we discussed President Lopez Obrador's military invasion of the Vulcan Material Company's port in the property of Mexico, and we had quite an extensive conversation. I talked about my trip into Mexico, into Central America, trying to understand what's going on there. And of course, things have not changed much. But as you know, the military has since left after taking it by military force. And the president has continued to harass Vulcan and is actively threatening to steal the company's land to access that port. It's a deep water port that Vulcan actually built. They spent their own money, $1 billion worth of investments to build that port. And now Mexico's just going to take it. It is the image that we're given here. Last year, we agreed these type of actions would have a chilling impact on the bilateral relationship and future with U.S. investments in Mexico. Considering the ongoing situation, what message would you send to the president and the next president of Mexico and the U.S. business community?
Thank you very much. Yes, I remember well our conversation about this last year, and I'd say two things. First, Vulcan, I believe, has filed an arbitration case with under NAFTA, which is pending, and so I can't take a position on the merits of the case, which is pending. I can say that as a general matter, these cases, these instances, yes, can very much negatively impact Mexico's efforts to attract investment from the United States, and by the way, from many other countries as well. So we think it's very important that Mexico take that into consideration because it will have an impact on what they seek to do, which is to bring in more investment. But on the particular matter, let's see where the case goes before the arbitration panel.
Well, and as you say that, American-based companies are losing a lot of money. What was mined or what is being mined from that facility is building roads here in America. It's very important in our infrastructure. And I know this administration has put a lot of emphasis on infrastructure. That's right. Why do we not support our American businesses more? Why aren't we letting the avocados and the fruits and vegetables sit at the border for a little while and let them figure out time frame? Because waiting a year, 2 years, 4 years for a court to work it out is not working. It's not working at all.
My hope and expectation would be that precisely because we tried to put, I believe the previous administration put processes into NAFTA, the revised NAFTA, that would enable it to look at these kinds of cases and act swiftly on them, not bottle them up for years. I think you're exactly right. It's imperative that happens. But there is a mechanism, there is an understanding about how we try to resolve these disputes, and that should play out, but it should, I agree with you, play out quickly. Meanwhile, we have our diplomats all over the world engaged every single day in commercial advocacy, commercial diplomacy, trying to resolve disputes, trying to make sure that our businesses, our workers are being treated fairly around the world. It's a critical part of their mission, and whether that's in Mexico or any other place around the world where the United States and our businesses are engaged, that's what our folks are there for every single day. And we, of course, will look at whatever measures are appropriate to try to make sure that we're being treated fairly with a level playing field.
Well, if the president of Mexico will do this to Vulcan Materials, they'll do it to anyone. And I highly encourage business communities in America that's looking at doing business down there to stop and think. because they may be next.
Thank you.
With that said, Mr. Chairman, I yield my time.
Well, thank you, Mr. Carl. Thank you for bringing this up. Look, this president of Mexico is acting less like an ally and more like an adversary. And so, thank you for bringing that up, sir. The gentleman from Florida, Ms. Frankel.
Good morning, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you so much for your good work in a very chaotic world, and I give the same praise to our president. I may not agree on every little detail, but I have to say, given the chaos of this world, I am very grateful for his very steady, experienced leadership. I am disappointed with the top lines of this budget, of course, because, again, with the chaos in the world, I do think more diplomacy and economic stability would bring us to more peace. I was in a meeting yesterday with 6 women ambassadors from around the world, including from Ukraine, including from Saudi Arabia, Lithuania. I'll try to think of the other ones, and Ireland and others. And here's what we got talking about is there are many conflicts in this world, and we know that there are some negotiations going on in the conflicts. And to our dismay, in talking to these ambassadors, what they were relating to us is there are very few, if no women, at the negotiating table. The ambassador from Saudi Arabia told me she's been the only woman at the table. And, number one, we know research shows that when women are part of the negotiations for peace, much likely that a treaty will last longer. But number two, we do bring a very different perspective. And so what I would like to hear from you is, what are the various conflicts around the world that we're actually participating in peace negotiations, and where are the women?
Thank you. First of all, I agree with the premise of the question or the statement, which is when we have women involved in matters of peace and security, we get better results. And I think we need to see and do more of that. And as you know, we have a Women, Peace, and Security initiative to try to ensure that. But if you look around at the conflicts that we're working every single day to resolve, to bring to an end, particularly many, alas, in Africa, whether it's in Sudan, whether it's the DRC and Rwanda and the Eastern Congo, whether it's challenges in Ethiopia, well, our Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, Molly Fee, is leading many of our efforts in those situations. We have a number of senior diplomats who are engaged around the world every day in trying to bring conflicts to an end. And I could go down the list, and I'm sure that you would find women who are critical leaders in those efforts. But again, I think the initiatives that we have to make sure that there is greater participation, engagement, involvement from women in dealing with these challenges, that's very much part of what we're doing. We have a strategy. We have an update that is being sent forward. Actually, we sent forward last year on that, and it reaffirms our commitment to elevate women's meaningful participation and protection on the other side of things as critical elements of our foreign policy and conflict prevention and conflict resolution.
Okay, well, let me, and I know there's so many, but I want to respectfully suggest that the State Department and the administration make more efforts to get the women at the table. I mean, it's really embarrassing or disappointing, I would say, when we heard that incidentally, the ambassador of Saudi Arabia did recount to us almost exactly what you told us this morning about the negotiations. So hopefully you're all on the same page there. But it was very disappointing when she tells us that when you're all sitting down to talk, she was the only woman in the room. That's should be a non-starter. So we're going to urge you to do better with that. We're going to have another round, is that right? Yeah, so I'm going to, I want to talk about a film I saw last night called Screams of Silence, which it's about the sexual violence committed by Hamas. I will say this, the last time I almost ran out of a movie, it was one of these horror movies that but this was those things are make-believe when but this was real. What I saw and heard last night was so horrifying, really, I could barely sit in my seat. And we didn't even see the pictures. We just saw the interviews. I'm going to talk more about that, Mr. Chair, when we do the second round.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Mr. LaTurner,
Thank you, Mr.
you're recognized, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for being here today, Secretary Blinken. I'm sure you're aware of the growing problem throughout Southeast Asia of scam compounds, often run by Chinese organized crime groups that are targeting more and more Americans every year. These fraud factories, which are increasingly prevalent in Burma, Cambodia, Thailand, can contain thousands of individuals who are trafficked, held against their will inside these compounds, and then forced to help perpetrate online scams referred to as pig butchering, where they develop a relationship with their victim and then push them into investing in fraudulent cryptocurrency apps or platforms. A recent estimate found that global losses from this type of activity have exceeded $64 billion. Can you share what the State Department is doing to combat not just this ongoing fraud, but also the human trafficking that contributes to it?
Thank you, and thank you for putting a spotlight on that, because it's something that is of deep concern to us. We have a comprehensive whole-of-government effort to combat trafficking persons and to combat different manifestations of that, including these scam factories. Literally, and this is something that the State Department helps lead, we have every relevant department in the government coming together, using its resources and doing it in a coordinated way to combat trafficking and to combat these different manifestations of it. And there are significant resources that go into that. There is a very significant effort to help countries develop the capacity themselves to push back against trafficking, to bring traffickers to justice, to help the victims of trafficking. And so building their capacity is critical. Law enforcement collaboration and cooperation is vital to this. Sharing information, of course, we have an annual trafficking in persons report that we put out that looks at countries, country by country, to see what they're doing or not doing, and what more needs to be done to get at the heart of this. But there's a very significant effort underway to deal with that.
Are you seeing the needle move on this particular issue?
We see it move in individual countries. I think, it's there are a number of countries, and the report makes this clear, where we've seen genuine, effective progress. There are other countries where we've seen backsliding or no progress, and the report lays all of this out.
Right. Recently, Amnesty International in Nigeria stated that over 1,300 people have been killed just in Plateau State alone since December, when the horrible Christmas massacres killed over 200 people, mostly Christians. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, in its recently released annual report, noted a study saying over 8,000 Christians have been targeted and murdered for their faith in Nigeria, most of them in the North and Middle Belt. These targeted killings have been increasing year over year, and especially now at such an alarming rate that it's hard to see how these militants are not operating with some degree of impunity. Secretary Blinken, since you removed Nigeria from the country of particular concern list in 2021, the USCIRF has recommended Nigeria be placed back on the list, and every year since, and has condemned its removal. The USCIRF has affirmed that government toleration of egregious, systematic, and ongoing violations of religious freedom is the standard for CPC status, and they make it very clear that Nigeria meets at least that standard. Given the horrendous targeted violence in the country that is at least in significant part motivated by religious factors, given these factors, why has the State Department for every year failed to follow the USCIRF's recommendations regarding a CPC designation?
First, let me say this. For us, defending religious freedom around the world is a foreign policy priority. And we are leveraging the global footprint that we have, our presence around the world that we want to sustain, to focus on cases of concern, to push back against repressive, discriminatory laws, policies, and practices, Much of this is highlighted, as you mentioned, in the annual report that we do, and this is at the heart of our efforts. We have in the law designation criteria that we take very, very seriously. We listen carefully to experts in civil society, experts on the ground. Our embassies are doing a tremendous amount of work in each of these countries, including Nigeria. And we listen very carefully to the independent U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom.
But they're wrong,
And
they're wrong in this case.
So in this case, and we have I think we have a different perspective in this particular case about whether, there's no doubt, it is clear that people of Christian faith in Nigeria have been on the receiving end of terrible abuses, oppression. But whether that is because of their religion or because they're part of a particular ethnic group in a particular region, that's a different question. And what we have not seen is the government of Nigeria, the federal government of Nigeria, engaging in these practices in terms of targeting Christians. Having said that, I was in Nigeria, I'm trying to remember exactly when, but I think it was within the last 6 or 7 months. And I brought together experts from civil society, from the religious communities, including leader of the Christian community in Nigeria, to hear directly from them. We talked to the government about the imperative that even if things were not being done at its behest or its acquiescence, that it take stronger action to protect people, and notably Christians who were, whether or not it was because of their religious status, being persecuted. And so this is something we're very focused on, irrespective of the designation.
I'm out of time, but I would hope we could find common ground at least on the special watch list designation. But I look forward to talking more about this.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Chairman, and good morning, Mr. Secretary. It's good to see you. When you came before the subcommittee last year, we spoke about the administration's goals in Central America to help stem the number of migrants, specifically the young people at our southern border, by ensuring that they have safety and opportunity to thrive within their own countries. Since that hearing, I'm very happy to see the steps that you have taken in the Northern Triangle, including progress on diplomatic appointments, as well as publicly naming corrupt and undemocratic actors. I want to encourage you to continue to work with U.S. Treasury to not only remove their visas, but freeze their assets so that we can make some real change in the region for those young people to be able to see a future that includes democracy and improve their lives in the region. Guatemala, in particular, faced a coup attempt last year, and now a step toward building an independent judiciary. The appointment process for many key judicial posts this year. Mr. Secretary, we must prioritize those governments who are our true partners, committed to democracy and investing in their own people to help build a better future for all of the Americas. Mr. Secretary, you have asked this committee for increased funding for the Western Hemisphere. It's a tough request, given, from my point of view, that we continue to see Russia continuing to run a mine in El Astor. Right now, there are hundreds of military and police officers that are seeking to, once again, commit brutal crimes against 29 families that remain there. 29 families of the families that were burnt out of their community. Most of them are indigenous people. These are the young people that we see at our southern border. You know, the last time they unleashed violence on this group, they utilized our own military equipment, JA Jeeps, that I had specifically requested that we remove from the region. So how will this funding be used responsibly to address the root cause of migration from Central America and continue to support the young people, but not continue to support old regimes like Giammattei, like Jimmy Morales? You know, the past ghosts of, violence and give this new administration an opportunity to thrive and make the change that is necessary.
Thank you very much. As it happens, I was in Guatemala just a few weeks ago.
Thank you for that.
And had a very good visit there. I'm impressed by the work that President Revelo and his administration are doing, and it's something that we strongly support and will continue to do. Second, I think we've seen when it comes to tackling root causes, because primarily, not exclusively, drivers of irregular migration, which is at historic levels around the world, and of course in our own hemisphere as well. One of the main drivers is a lack of basic economic opportunity. And if people can't put food on the table for their kids to eat, they will do anything and go anywhere to try to make sure that they can do that. One way at getting at this is actually creating greater opportunity. Vice President Harris has led a very significant effort over the last few years to generate significantly more private sector investment in the so-called Northern Triangle countries, in Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. And we've seen an increase of about $4.5 billion of such investment. That is going to create, and is already creating, new opportunities, new jobs, so that people actually have the choice to remain in their own countries. Of course, at the same time, we're doing other things to include expanding legal pathways to this country to take pressure off the border. We have safe mobility offices so that people can make determinations in their own country whether they are legally entitled to come to the United States instead of coming to the border to do that. But I think the root causes piece, it takes time, but it is fundamentally the best way to get at it because, again, if people are experiencing conditions.
I want to interrupt you for a
please go
moment
ahead.
because I cannot let you walk out of here without mentioning Jose Ruben Zamora and the fact that he continues to be in prison, in a Guatemalan prison, simply for speaking truth to power about the corruption and these corrupt actors. The Attorney General continues to thrive in the region, and I'm not sure how much more we can do to ensure that this action from the Attorney General is reversed. Angelica Coy Chuck, she's a Mayan elder. She was recently sentenced to 75 years in prison. She still has multiple shrapnel on her leg. She has been refused medical attention. This is a woman from El Astor, where, again, the government continues to work against indigenous people that are simply trying to farm and live another day in their own country. I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Torres. Mr. Susquehanna.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Blinken, for being here with us today. Like many of my colleagues here, and this has been briefly touched on, I'm incredibly concerned about the ongoing war in Israel and what appears to be a shifting position from the administration regarding our steadfast support for our greatest ally in the region. The National Security Supplemental included significant assistance for Israel. Does the administration remain committed to spending every dollar appropriated for Israel in the supplemental?
Yes.
Can you please elaborate on that?
No, happy to. Yes, simply put, yes, every single dollar in the supplemental that Congress passed will be spent. And let me share a few things. First, no one has done more or will continue to do more to ensure Israel's defense than the President of the United States. He was there in the days after October 7th, the first American president to be in Israel at a time of war. We deployed significant assets to the region to prevent other fronts from opening and Israel being attacked from other places, including from the north in Lebanon by Hezbollah or by Iran. More recently, when you had this unprecedented attack by Iran on Israel, the first direct attack from Iran to Israel, for the first time in history, the United States participated actively in Israel's defense, and of course we brought together a coalition of countries to thwart that attack, which happened very successfully as a result of the efforts that we undertook. And we've tried to make sure that Israel has what it needs to defend itself against the threats that it faces, not only from Hamas, but Hezbollah, Iran, the Houthis, various Iranian proxies.
I appreciate that.
But when it comes to, I think, the case that you're referencing, I'm happy to address that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I was in Israel, and just a few days, less than a week after I came back, that's when Iran launched the attack. So this is obviously fresh in my view of coming back there, learning about the situation on the ground. You're right, it was the attack directly from Iran, not through just the proxies, was not expected. And when that happened, obviously that raised the concerns on this. What raises concerns as well is obviously the administration's decision to withhold arms to our ally as conditions to strategy by Israel in terms of this conflict. So in the future, would you commit to work with Congress on any withholdings from congressionally appropriated dollars in arms?
Well, two things. First, when it comes to the particular case that you're referencing, that is these 2,000-pound bombs, we've been very clear for a long time about our concerns about a full-scale military assault on Rafah, given the dense population there, and particularly the use of that kind of weapon in a dense urban environment. It's a conversation that was ongoing with Israel, and it's unfortunate that it became public, but it did. But we have an ongoing conversation with Israel about this and about our concerns about the use of these particular weapons in that particular way in that particular place, and those concerns remain. But the other assistance that we've been providing for Israel's defense continues and will continue because, again, the President's determined that Israel have what it needs to defend itself. At the same time, we're deeply committed to trying to ensure that people are better protected in Gaza, people who are caught in this crossfire of Hamas is making, that the humanitarian assistance they desperately need gets to them. The operations in and around Rafah have also disrupted that. And then finally, we're also committed to try to make sure that Israel is actually successful in dealing effectively and durably with Hamas. And we do have some different views on the best way to do that. And when you're a good friend and close partner, it's your responsibility to share your views and to give your best advice and counsel. If Israel goes full on into Rafah to eliminate the remaining battalions, as they put it, the problem will not be solved. There will be thousands and thousands of remaining armed Hamas even after that happens. Israel will inherit a major insurgency in Gaza that it will be responsible for. If it decides to leave Gaza, which we believe it must, it can't reoccupy Gaza, then you will have Hamas continuing to run Gaza. That's unacceptable. Or you'll have total anarchy and lawlessness. That should be unacceptable.
The existence of
plan,
Hamas is unacceptable.
Yes, so
there
needs to be a concrete plan that does not involve Israel's reoccupation, does not involve Hamas continuing to rule Gaza, does not involve lawlessness and anarchy. And we want to see such a plan come forward from Israel. We've been working on one with Arab partners for months, but it would be imperative because otherwise, again, they are not solving the problem that we both want to solve. We have other ways that we've shared with them at more effectively getting at Hamas and also doing it in a way that lessens the danger to civilians who are caught in this crossfire.
Well, Mr. Secretary, this Congress was clear on that vote on our desire and intention to support Israel in defending itself, and wiping out Hamas is they rightfully have to do, and the world will be a better place without Hamas. And I appreciate your commitment to use every dollar allocated by this Congress for our close friend and ally Israel as they fight this horrific war in the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Secretary Blinken, it's an honor to meet you. Thank you for being with us today. During my recent trips abroad, I saw firsthand how state-run agencies aim to push propaganda and silence free speech. The State Department spends millions combating disinformation. $12 million in 2024 at the Global Engagement Center, to be exact. On page 28 of the Congressional Budget Justification for fiscal year 2025, your department's asking for an additional $1.5 million to counter CCP propaganda and disinformation under the public diplomacy line item for the Global Engagement Center. Why is $12 million not enough, and can you give this committee a little bit of a perspective in how those funds are going to be deployed?
Yeah, thank you. No, thank you very much. So the Global Engagement Center, this is the only part of our government that is singularly focused, dedicated to coordinating our efforts to counter foreign propaganda, misinformation, disinformation. And we have seen, I think, a growing number of allies looking to the Global Engagement Center for help and assistance in standing up their own capacity. We now have many countries that have signed on to a framework that the Global Engagement Center has put out to more effectively see and respond to the disinformation and misinformation that's being used against them as well as against us. And the GEC is the place where that happens. And we've seen real success in the efforts to expose and actually take action against this. We had the GEC release the first comprehensive analysis of how China uses deceptive, coercive techniques to reshape the global information environment. That was incredibly informative for countries around the world. We've exposed disinformation techniques in a variety of countries by China, by Russia, by Iran. We've revealed campaigns, for example, to undermine our efforts at helping countries get health security by trying to distort what we were doing. We've exposed efforts of these countries, notably Russia and China, to, in effect, infiltrate local media in countries around the world, notably in Africa. All of this was done as a result of the work of the GEC. But in some sense, it's a drop in the bucket because this really is a major front now in competition. That is the information front. And if we're not resourced to do what we need to do, both to see it, to expose it, to do something about it, and to coordinate cooperation among like-minded countries, we're going to be on, I think, on the wrong end of the balance on this. So for us, the GEC is the one place in government where all of this comes together, and we've seen its effectiveness increasingly around the world.
And thank you for that. Am I garnering from your response that the strategy is to over-propaganda those folks that are offering the propaganda, or is there anything that we can do to stop them?
Yeah, I think, again, part of it is in exposing it and discrediting it, it becomes much less effective. I'll give you one example of something that on one level seems a bit more benign, but is actually quite pernicious. We have instances in a number of countries where Russia, in particular, would provide press services that would then be published looking like these were articles, for example, that were being done by local journalists, when in fact it was actually Russian propaganda from RT and from other organizations. Well, one of the things we organized was to be able to provide for these newspapers or online publications access to things like Reuters, the Associated Press, that would be obviously different from and objective compared to what they were getting and hiding, in a sense, the origin of when it comes to what Russia was trying to feed in. So there are big things, there are small things, but I think when you see the disinformation and misinformation exposed, that's the most important thing, because then people understand that what they're hearing and what they're seeing has an ulterior motive.
Thank you very much for your response, Mr. Chairman. I've got other questions. I hope we'll have another round or so.
Well, your question is spot on. We're going to do another round of 3 minutes because, again, that's the time that we have. As soon as we have this ready, we'll start. Mr. Secretary, I think a lot of us, and it's pretty clear, have lost faith with the WHO, and it was reflected in the 24 bill passed out of the House. I'm particularly concerned about the direction of the negotiations on the pandemic treaty and international health regulations. Reportedly, negotiations continue, but we may not see the final proposal until just before the vote of the WHO. My understanding is the draft may include many provisions like, well, frankly, that we outright reject, such as violations of property rights, treating China like a developing country, granting China and other improper access to U.S. capabilities. What can you tell us about the current draft of the treaty and whether it contains these highly problematic provisions that I mentioned and other potentially problematic provisions?
Mr. Chairman, in short, we're determined that any treaty that would emerge, or any agreement that emerges, reflects our clear interests as well as our clear values, including on property rights and including in terms of our relationship with the PRC. I think where it currently stands is that it seems very unlikely that negotiations could conclude successfully in the next days. There's not consensus. We've been trying to build that consensus, reflective of those interests that you cited, but also the interests of many countries around the world. in making sure that we're better prepared for next time. They're better prepared, that they have their own capacity to detect, to deal with, necessary to produce things like vaccines. So all of that is part of the conversation, but I don't think, based on the latest I've seen, that this is going to come to a conclusion in the near term.
If it does, though, would you plan to submit the treaty to the Senate so that it can fulfill its
I am sure we
constitutional
will
obligations?
fully consult with Congress as appropriate on anything that we do.
But consult with Congress is not necessarily sending to the Senate to fulfill their constitutional, in other words, for their approval.
If there is a constitutional requirement, we will fulfill it.
Well, but I would hope that you would lean, even if there's a gray zone that you might look at, that you would obviously, do that and send it to the Senate to fulfill their role as a treaty.
Of course. If it's a
Ms. Lee, right?
Thank you very much. First of all, very quickly, the United Nations. In the House bill last year, no funding was included for the United Nations regular budget. Zero to pay our treaty dues to the organization, and yet we keep hearing a lot from our House colleagues about the threat of the PRC and strategic competition. So, Mr. Secretary, how does the United States' participation and leadership at the United Nations relate to countering China's influence? And what would be the impact of the United States being absent from the United Nations, as last year's bill proposed? And then secondly, if we have time, if not, you can give us the response in writing, with regard to the Caribbean. Okay, I'm pleased to see, and you mentioned the request to include the addition of 2 missions in the Caribbean. These are our closest neighbors, yet the United States has very little presence. Barbados, for example, has to cover the ambassador's 6 countries in the Eastern Caribbean with little means to access them. Now, I heard and understand that it's going to take about 5 years to gear up and to ramp up for these 2 new diplomatic missions. So what happens in the meantime? We don't have any time to waste, and so I don't want to know what plan is in place to ramp up these engagements in the Caribbean until we get the 2 new embassies open.
So thank you very much, and I'll try to be quick. Look, on the United Nations, we've seen a very concerted effort by China in recent years to engage, and more than engage, to try to seek positions in the United Nations so that it could have real influence over the direction that the UN takes on under the sun. Be like it or not, the United Nations is engaged in pretty much everything. It's engaged in ways that are profoundly helpful to the United States, because if the United Nations were not doing things like feeding children, vaccinating people, looking out for maternal health, making sure that people had access to electricity, et cetera, then either we'd have to be doing it on our own or no one would be doing it, and the world would be a much worse place, and that would inevitably come back to bite us. So in so many ways, it provides absolutely vital functions. One of the strange positions we're in is, if you look at program across program at the United Nations, the United States is typically the leading funder, and it's producing really important results, again, for us, because absent those results, you're going to have even more people on the move, more conflict, more economic deprivation. All of this gets spun up in ways that inevitably bite us. So we're often the leading funder, and yet when we have an inability to pay our dues on time, or we get arrears on various accounts, that's a wonderful talking point for our competitors, including China or Russia, that spend far less in the United Nations, but then point to us as being the laggards. So it just doesn't make any sense, and it actually has practical implications for our ability to sustain programs that are vital to our own national interest. And then, of course, we want to make sure that we have a seat at every table where decisions are being made about norms, rules, standards that often the UN is a part of setting. So if that's taken away, we're out of the room. It's not a good thing for the United States.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
And I'll follow up with you later if I can.
The distinguished Chief Deputy Whip of the House, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, Mr. Secretary. Thanks for being here. Mr. Secretary, it's my estimation that your department is just weak, it's feckless, and at best, your department is incompetent. I could go through a litany of examples. We could talk about Afghanistan. We could talk about the missteps you had in Ukraine. We could talk about the Houthi rebels. We talk about the vacillation with Israel. But the most distilled example is the most recent, and that's Turks and Caicos. The reason so distilled is you don't have the complexity of the other issues. Turks and Caicos, you have 5 Americans that are wrongfully detained, not technically wrongfully detained in a word of, in a phrase of diplomacy, but these are individuals that had at most 20 rounds of ammunition. They've been treated atrociously by a government that represents 60,000 people in a geography that has a landmass that's roughly 2.5 the size of DC. I mean, this is not even a sovereign nation. It's a protector to the British Empire or the UK. And you can't tell me that you can't put a do not travel today on Turks and Caicos and bring the 4 Americans that still remain in Turks and Caicos home. It would take one order to bring 4 Americans home. 4 Americans, by the way, one is a grandmother from Florida she was caught with 2 rounds of ammunition in her purse. She was chained to a desk for 3 days. Your State Department, your officials, did not come and visit her. It was up to the other American detainees to bring her food, water, a pillow, a blanket for that night. My constituents, your State Department didn't even call my constituent for 2 months into his detention. Even though he was in a jail for a period of days, no health and comfort visit from your department. So again, I'm just really baffled by again the weakness and incompetence of your department. You can prove me wrong. Issue the do not travel to Turks and Caicos today. Bring the Americans home. I yield back.
Well, thank you, Congressman. It won't surprise you to know that I fundamentally
Mr.
disagree with
Secretary
you.
Blinken, I yield back to the chair. You don't need to say anything. You can issue a detention. You can issue a do not travel, end the detention of those Americans and bring them home. We're done talking. You need to now act. That is what you need to do. Issue the do not travel today. Bring them home.
I'd be happy to respond.
Thank you, gentlemen. Well, he yielded back, Mr. Secretary, but
Well, it's a nice, it's a wonderful technique to make a statement and not give you a chance to respond.
Well, why don't we give you some time to respond then? Because we do have a little bit of
I'd
time.
simply say, Congressman, I welcome working with you on this, and please bring the information forward to me. Second, we have a State Department and extraordinary men and women who every single day are working to get arbitrarily detained Americans back home with their families and loved ones. And we've had more success in this administration in doing that than in any previous administration. And Roger Carstens and his team are at this every single day. And we brought Americans home from all over the world, and it's our #1 priority. So I will apologize to no one for the efforts that our people make every day to help Americans who are in jeopardy anywhere around the world.
Wanted to make sure that you had an opportunity to respond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I
Secretary.
appreciate
Obviously, we do need to bring these folks home, and hopefully, like, pronto. Ranking member, full committee ranking member, Ms. Delauro.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Let me ask a question about UNRWA, and I'm just going to tick off some facts and ask you to answer a couple of questions here. 2024 funding law prohibited funding for UNRWA through March of 2025. By the commentary from all of the non-governmental offices that I've talked to, UNRWA is an indispensable partner in conveying life-saving aid to refugees in the Gaza Strip. They have 13,000 staff, and I might add they've lost over 200 people as a result of the conflict there. And cutting off funding for a critical partner has, in my view, exacerbated the crisis here. But it's not just Gaza, because the implications, just very quickly, for Lebanon and Jordan are really fundamental. Many in this room troubled, more than troubled, by the allegations that 12 UNRWA employees were involved in that October 7th horrific attack. That is not to be tolerated under any set of circumstances. Since then, UNRWA has delivered accountability. They've taken steps to terminate the relationship, and I believe that they have eliminated those folks, or they fired those folks, promised to take action. Unclear whether the same can be said for there's 5 units of the Israeli Defense Forces found to have committed gross violations of human rights against Palestinian civilians. Your department has affirmed that 4 of the 5 units have effectively remediated these violations. Serious questions about whether there's been true accountability. The NSM report recently says that there's credible reports that violations of human rights in Israel has used U.S.-provided defense articles inconsistent with international humanitarian law. I'm going to pose the questions all at once, Mr. Secretary. We read the Kelowna report, which I assume you have, on the vetting and other processes that UNRWA has in place to ensure the neutrality of staff. UNRWA said it's committed to implementing the report's recommendations. Do you see this as a serious attempt to address the shortcomings in UNRWA's operations? Isn't this a double standard? U.S. holding all partners accountable, Hamas, Israel, and our international partners. Can you clarify what effective remediation of these human rights violations means in the context of these 4 IDF units? Each was treated as a lone perpetrator. Most of the perpetrators went through the justice system, but some are already out on parole. Is that accountability for a gross violation of human rights? There isn't much time left, and I would ask the indulgence of the chair if I could have a little bit of time for the Secretary to respond.
We will ask
I think that this is a
We will ask the Secretary to try to answer
issue.
quickly and succinctly.
Thank you.
Thank you,
It's a
Mr. Chairman.
critically important issue, I
Yes,
think.
so very quickly, we strongly support the recommendations of the independent Kelowna report. She used to be my counterpart as French Foreign Minister. I think that report's very important, and its recommendations need to be implemented. Second, there's an ongoing UN internal investigation of the particular allegations related to individuals who were both members of UNRWA and allegedly participated in the horrors of October 7th, where we await that UN internal investigation. But I do believe that UNRWA plays a critical and necessary role in trying to get humanitarian assistance to people who need it in Gaza. No one else has the same network. So we want to see these reforms go forward. And of course, we have laws that Congress has passed in terms of what we're able to do or not able to do, but we believe that UNRWA does play a critical function. So others may choose to support its efforts, but we also want to make sure that the reforms go forward. When it comes to the Leahy law that you referenced, a critical part of that law is seeing appropriate remediation when an individual or a unit has been engaged in a gross violation of human rights that is that receives our assistance. And in the cases that have come before the State Department, which we have looked at very, very, very carefully, we found gross violations of human rights committed by individuals in 5 different units. In 4 cases, Israel did take appropriate and effective remediation under their laws, and that typically includes anything from disciplining to discharging to prosecuting to convicting, depending on the case and on the law, the individuals. In 1 case, while action was taken, we didn't have sufficient information to determine that the remediation had been sufficient, and we're in an ongoing discussion with Israel on that.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Siscomani.
Mr. Secretary, the steep increase that we have seen in migrant encounters during the last 3 years has not only to do with our domestic and asylum policies and enforcement, but also can be linked to the signals we're sending our neighboring countries and around the world. I hear and see consistently the impact of the porous border policies are having in my communities. Now, when the Biden administration began, you all swiftly suspended the asylum cooperative agreements that we had with El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Additionally, you all ended the migrant protection protocols, also known as Remain in Mexico, that we had a cooperative agreement with Mexico on that, both that had been working. In the statement you wrote, you said the Biden administration believes there are more suitable ways to work with our partner governments to manage migration across the region. That was your statement. Mr. Secretary, I would note that while we vehemently disagree over the value of these agreements, I would be pleased if we had seen a positive result from the end of these agreements. However, we have not. That's not an opinion, that's a fact. Numbers show it. So do you believe that ending these agreements has yielded a net positive result as it relates to U.S. interest?
Well, I think we are seeing positive, necessary, but still insufficient results. We've seen, for example, as a result of the work that we were doing with Mexico, encounters decrease significantly from where they were in December by about half. The different things that we're putting into play.
Secretary, I'm sorry to interrupt on that, but December was the record-breaking all-time high.
Yeah, I'm talking about,
no,
I agree with
better
you.
than that I wouldn't call that the bar of success.
Well, of course, there's a bill before Congress right now. Again, a bill that unfortunately wasn't passed a few months ago that I believe is back before Congress that would, we believe, that the President strongly supports, would make a very meaningful difference in dealing with the challenges at our border, and hopefully it will pass. I think that would give us important additional tools that could be very effective on top of what we're doing. But I think there are other things, Congressman, that are important, including, of course, the enforcement piece, of course, expanding legal pathways so that people can come here if they qualify legally, but also one of the initiatives that we have, these safe mobility offices. This is a critical tool because in the countries where they have been established, it allows people to determine without leaving their countries whether they're actually lawfully eligible to come to the United States. And so they don't come to the border. We've established these now in half a dozen countries. We've seen actually very positive results from that in terms of people using it as a means of determining whether they have a legal basis to come to the United States. So I think we have to do everything across the board. It's, of course, the enforcement, making sure that migration is both orderly, humane, and safe.
These actions, and some, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to jump in here, sir. But these efforts, as I look at the numbers, you can compare it to December, and any month in the existence of the United States will look better compared to December of 2023. So again, that's not the proper standard that I would like to go by. Still, numbers are on the rise once again. They're much higher than they were 3 years ago. So all these measures, compared to the measures that were in place in 19 and even 20, are not working as well, because we see the numbers that have gone up by 200, 300%. They're not going down significantly in the way that if we are approaching and applying an all the above approach, it's simply not working. My constituents are feeling it every single day. I'm someone that was born in Mexico, went through the process, became a citizen in 2006, and a member of Congress in 2022. I believe in the American dream and the opportunities this country offers. However, what we're seeing on the border and the abuse in our system, the rule of law, is not the way that we want to be welcoming people. It's endangering them, creating a humanitarian crisis, as well as a national security crisis. So I would challenge the premise that this is working. It's not, Mr. Secretary, and we need to take serious action on this. And one more item, we talk about legislation that has been passed. This Congress, on Republican majority, we passed the H.R. 2, the border security bill. It went to go sit in the Senate. That bill alone would have dealt with this issue immediately. So I call on my colleagues to do the right thing here, but also on you, sir, to make sure that this works. And what we're seeing right now is not working.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. You want to, if you want a few seconds to.
No, just to say, look, I think there's important legislation before the Congress now. Unfortunately, it didn't pass the House a couple of months ago. It's back up. I think that could, added to the efforts that we've already made, make a real difference. So I would think that bill would be a good proof point for whether we can take further effective steps.
We're going to recognize, Mr. Secretary, I would also remind you, as Mr. Siscomani said, that H.R. 2 has been passed. It's not in consideration. It passed a long time ago. And I would hope that you would look at that as a great option and maybe support that as well. Ms. Meng.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Blinken, in your testimony, you highlighted an investment of $500 million to expand internet access around the world. But according to the World Bank in 2022, only 36% of Africa's population had broadband internet access. Internet access benefits everyone, as you know, children going to school who can take advantage of more learning resources, farmers who can get information about the weather, and small business owners who can reach more customers across the continent and the world. With competing companies like Huawei taking advantage of billions in incentive dollars, do you believe $500 million is enough to meet the need for internet access across the African continent?
Well, in and of itself, it's not. But the fact that it can act as a catalyst, that it can act as a resource for the government to help do two things: to marshal our own resources across our government and align them, including with institutions like the Development Finance Corporation, but then to coordinate effectively with other countries and other partners. For example, as we're doing in the Indo-Pacific, Pacific Islands, bringing underseas cables to the Pacific Islands, working with Japan, working with Taiwan, working with others, and then, as I mentioned earlier, to be a catalyst for the private sector. Because no, we can't finance these things totally on taxpayer dollars, but we can play a critical role in clearing the way for the private sector, in making sure that we provide, for example, necessary risk insurance, that we help do some of the due diligence that's necessary for for these projects to go forward, that we build the capacity of local governments to do what they need to do to make these projects viable. That's what the money's for. Now, could we use more? Sure, we always can, but we try to make a deliberate judgment about what could give us the effective resources we need to do all of these other things that get the results that you're exactly right we need to see.
Great, and I know I'm running out of time, but I just wanted to highlight in the fiscal year 22 omnibus, it directed both the State Department and USAID to develop a strategy or policy around youth. USAID, in response, updated its youth policy in May 2022, but wanted to ask about the State Department's plans in leading a youth strategy as directed. Are conversations taking place, and when can we expect to see a strategy like this?
Let me come back to you on this. I'm happy to follow up on that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mang. Mr. Edwards, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Secretary, in September last year, the Office of the Inspector General published an audit on the selected cooperative agreements supporting the Department of State's Resettlement Support Centers, the RSC. The Inspector General found that selected refugee recipients of cooperative agreement funds did not always adhere to the federal requirements, department guidance, or award terms and conditions. In fact, the OIG found that 65% of refugee applications reviewed had deficiencies, and none of the 12 RSC caseworkers observed conducted pre-screening interviews in accordance with requirements. The OIG then found evidence that selected award recipients didn't always spend funds in accordance with federal requirements. Specifically, they tested 144 expenditures totaling nearly $2 million and found that 17% of those allocated funds would have been unallowable. Can you please inform this committee what measurable steps the State Department and Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration have taken to address these deficiencies and to systematically and deficiencies and the wasted resources? Thank you.
No, thank you, Congressman. Two things on this. First, we've been engaged in a very significant effort to rebuild the resettlement program in the United States, which was in significant disrepair when we came into. It's required a very significant effort to get these resettlement organizations back up and running, and not only running, but running efficiently, effectively, and of course, following the law. Second, we take very seriously the work, the investigations of the Inspector General, and we are always working to follow up and take action when we find that something needs remediation. And so we're working intensely with the resettlement agencies to make sure that they are following the letter of the law when it comes to the use of our monies and of taxpayers' monies. But I'm happy to follow up with your office in more detail on this and can share that. Thank you.
Please, in my last half a minute, can you tell us, has the PRM recovered any of the costs determined to be unallowable or any of the $759,000 the OIG questioned in the report?
Let me come back to you on that. I don't have an answer for you right now, but I'll get you one.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I want to thank everybody for sticking to the 3 minutes. We want to be responsible, and again, the gentleman from Florida, Ms. Frankel.
I was talking about this film I saw last night, which was a recap of the sexual violence, the brutality of Hamas when they attacked Israel October 7th, as well as women still being held in Gaza, chained, being raped. And the descriptions of what happened October 7th, they didn't have to show the pictures. They interviewed people who heard what was going on and what they saw with nails and objects in women's private parts, women being raped and passed around and their breasts cut off and burned and horrible. Interesting. The movie is called Screams Before Silence. That's because they heard the screams, and then there was silence because the women were killed. But, Mr. Secretary, what I'm worried about and what I am dismayed about, and I don't understand, is the silence of the world. The silence of the world about the brutality of Hamas, the silence of the world about horrible things that are happening all over the world, Sudan, Ukraine, Haiti, Myanmar. I could go on and on where millions of people are suffering. And yet, the protests are about Israel. And this is what I don't understand. And I don't want to, I'm not trying to demean the passion of any particular protester, but I'm wondering, is there some sort of organized effort to create conflict in our country? Are organized efforts to fund these protests? What is driving the fact that the protests are, despite every horror in this world, is going on against Israel and in part the United States?
Well, first, I think the horrific, almost unimaginable sexual violence that you've pointed to and that this film shows, and I've seen the evidence of it myself on trips, is horrific, and the world, the United Nations, was very late to identifying that and talking about that. And more broadly, one of the things that we've seen is that Hamas has almost been erased from the story, as if it didn't exist, didn't do anything, isn't doing anything right now. And one does have to ask why. I think, look, people are genuinely motivated by passion. The plight of little children, women, men in Gaza, the humanitarian crisis that they're experiencing is gut-wrenching. And I think most people likely motivated by that. And I not to do something about it. But I also agree with you that as a general proposition, we should try to avoid having selective outrage. And we need to see, hopefully, a focus on all of these other challenges where people are experiencing the worst of humanity and where we're working to change that, but it would be good if there was more focus there as well.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, and thank you for bringing that up. I would just say follow the money. Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Chairman, and I hope to be able to have a follow-up with you on just what is happening in that region as it relates to the farms that were also decimated in Israel during that October 7th attack. But, Mr. Secretary, as you know, the European Union this Tuesday endorsed new rules on artificial intelligence, which one headline called a benchmark for the rest of the world. If we are not at the table on global AI discussions, the rest of the world will move forward without us, unfortunately. We must be a part of the conversation for this revolution in the production of knowledge. From tools to increase productivity to the challenge of deep fakes, AI is already changing the world, and we must make sure that it is changing it for the better, helping us create a more peaceful world for us to thrive in. Mr. Secretary, given President Biden's work on AI policy and your own efforts in this space, what role do you see for the State Department in global efforts to ensure AI is working for us to build a better world? And I should mention, Mr. Secretary, that I am working on funding to support local cities and states across our country to partner with cities and regions in allied countries on AI research projects, something similar to our Sisters City program.
That sounds like a terrific initiative, and I'd love to learn more about it. But very quickly, I think the State Department is playing and must play a central role in this. We've reorganized the department to do just that. We established the first bureau for cyber and digital policy with a special envoy for emerging technologies to include AI, to make sure that diplomatically, not only could we have a seat at the table, we would be at the head of the table when the norms, the standards, the rules by which technology like AI gets used actually gets decided. We were able at the United Nations to get through the first resolution overwhelmingly passed the General Assembly as a result of our diplomacy on artificial intelligence to try to begin to establish principles for its use that would maximize the good, minimize the bad, and, for example, focus AI on the benefits it can bring to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, which, as you know, are stalled, and AI can make a huge difference. We've been leading in the G7 countries again, to begin to establish understandings about norms and standards for AI, on safety, on security, on privacy protection, on eliminating bias, on making sure that technologies can't be used for misinformation or disinformation. In all of these places, the State Department is playing a leading role. Our diplomats, and happily, we have some extraordinary people who come to the department who are leaders in the field who are making that
My
difference.
time is up. I want to encourage you to continue your efforts in working with Israel and in that region, our partners there, to ensure that we, one, get our hostages back, and ultimately we see an end to this war. And I yield back.
Well, thank you, Ms. Torres. Obviously, members may submit additional questions. For the record, Mr. Secretary, as you can see, there's a lot of interest, a lot of passion, and a lot of knowledge in the members of this subcommittee. We all look forward to continuing working with you. Thank you once again for your time. And with that, this concludes the hearing of the Subcommittee on State Foreign Operations and Related Programs. We stand adjourned.
Thank you.